Yep, it's all good. Thanks, Steve.
All right, morena koutou. Thanks very much for joining the webinar this morning. If we can just start by asking everyone to turn off their microphones, put them on mute for now, and that would make sure that everyone can hear each other clearly. So kia ora koutou, ko Harvey Brooks toko ingoa. I'm the Executive Director of the Waikato Wellbeing Project, and it's my privilege and an honour to welcome you to the first of our series on affordable energy in the Waikato. This series starts today and will run right through to October and November, pardon me, and I'll give you a little bit more information about it at the end of our presentation after we've had a conversation with our guest as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping to begin with. This hui is being recorded. And so if you're uncomfortable with your video image being on the recording, please turn off your camera now. We will make the recording available on our website and on our social media platforms probably within the next 3 to 5 days, and it will be available for everyone to have a look at. I'm sure you're all going to have some thoughts and comments and questions as we go through the hui today and listen to Geoff. If you do, please use the chat function. Put your questions and your comments in there, and then Amy, who's our comms leader, will keep a close eye on those, and she will summarize those at the end and put the questions and the comments to Geoff or to me if they're relevant to Wellbeing Waikato, and that way we can make sure everyone's thoughts get reflected. Other than that, I think we'll now make a little bit of a start. And Amy, if you can just turn on your mic and confirm, can you see the slide, the front slide?
Yes, I can.
Awesome, thank you. All right, whānau, well, I'll start us with a karakia and then head into the introduction. He karakia. Whakataka hau ki te uru, whakataka hau ki te taonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā tara tara ki tai, e hi yaki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhunga, haumi e hui e, tai ki e.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Again, welcome to this really exciting webinar series. If you are joining one of our webinars for the first time today, kia ora, welcome. Just a little bit about us, the Wellbeing Waikato, who we are and what we do. So we're an independent charitable trust focused on surfacing regional intelligence and knowledge about what's most important to households and whānau and identifying emerging risks early on. We try to surface underlying drivers, not just symptoms, and we do that by bringing together really good qualitative and quantitative data, whether it's existing or we collect it ourselves, and we try to combine that with information on lived experience and what's it really like for people to be experiencing some of the challenges that are in our communities. We convene government, iwi, councils, community organisations and the private sector around decision useful insights, which we then make those freely available for people to use in their day-to-day work or as citizens and the community. And you can see some examples of those along the bottom of the slide deck in terms of areas like kai-in food, housing, well-being in different geographies, and so forth. And today we're starting the process on energy, electricity. In terms of what is the foundation for the way we work, we've basically said we're a broad church on that. We started with the Sustainable Development Goals. We think things like the Living Standards Framework, Te Whare Tapa Whā, you choose it. I think they're all very, very similar in a lot of ways. We think actually Norm Kirk had it pretty right in 1969, where he said that basically there are 4 things that matter to people. They have somewhere to live, they have food to eat, they have clothing to wear, and they have something to hope for. Now, what I've done is slightly adulterated that, I think, for a more modern time. I think clothing to wear is not so much of an issue for a lot of people these days. I've replaced that with access to energy. And it's those 3 things: housing, food, access to energy, which we're really, really focused on. And as you can see the diagram on the right, my suggestion is, well, actually Maslow had this well understood a long time ago as well. So energy, electricity. You may have heard of the energy trilemma. Our electricity energy systems need to be both affordable, they need to be reliable. In other words, if you turn the switch on, something happens, whether it's in the middle of the day or the middle of a cold, dark, calm night in the middle of winter. And they need to be sustainable as well, both in terms of sustainable into the future, but also sustainable in an environmental, cultural and social sense as well. So this is the only data I'll offer, and then I'll leave the real data crunching to Geoff. But here are a couple of graphs which really have brought this home to us. And one of these is from our State of the Region report as well, and that's the one on the left. And that looks at the changes in real prices for two key energy sources, domestic electricity and 91 petrol. Domestic electricity is in the dark green line and petrol's in the light blue line since 1974. And what's remarkable is that the real price of petrol, this is pre-Iranian conflict, since 1974 has only gone up 1.39 times. So not really very much at all. And yet electricity has gone up 2.23 times. Now, one of those things is produced around the world in some of the most volatile regions of the world, and there have been 16 conflicts since 1970 about oil. And you would think it would that would be reflected in price. And the other one, electricity, is produced mainly naturally in New Zealand and is relatively plentiful, and yet it has become extraordinarily expensive. On the right is some work that was done and presented at the Hidden Energy Hardship Hui recently about energy hardship measures in New Zealand since 2013. And there's been a remarkable and unfortunate increase in things like the number of people who cannot afford to keep their dwellings adequately warm. They can't pay their bills. They are putting up with feeling persistently cold, and they have issues in their houses such as mold and mildew. So something's not right with this system. And that's really what's got us involved in this, if you like, and wanting to open out the conversation about why this is, because energy is something that is around us all the time, but often don't think we really know where it comes from, how it works, why it doesn't work, and what can be done about that in the future. So with that in mind, it's our real pleasure to welcome Geoff Bertram to speak to us today on this topic. And Geoff is the visiting scholar in the School of History, Philosophy, Political Science and International Relations at Victoria University. He's had many senior roles at Victoria going right back to 1976 in areas such as economics, finance and policy studies. And before that, he was a research officer at the Institute of Economics and Statistics at Oxford University in the UK. If you visit his website, you'll see how prolific Geoff is. He writes across a wide range of topics, including economic theory, electricity, as we're talking about today, energy and climate change, the New Zealand economy, and regulation. So it's a huge honour to have Geoff joining us today to speak about his thoughts about electricity and the future. And so with that, Geoff, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to you and invite you to speak to our audience today. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Now, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, that's on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, let's go. So what I want to do today, just to give you a quick foreshadowing, I want to start by talking about the symptoms of failure in the New Zealand system. This is familiar stuff, so I hope I can whiz through it a bit. Then I want to do some basic economic theory to show you how I frame up in my own head the questions that arise with electricity, pricing and supply. Using that basic theory, I want to talk about the current wholesale market setup and where some of the problems arise. Then I want to talk about competition for the market, which is where we talk about the new technologies that are coming into the market now and which are potentially quite disruptive. And then finally, I want to come on to the question of how we redesign the market with a single central goal in my mind, which is to bring residential prices for electricity down. because I think they're unsustainably and unrealistically high for the long run, and then have a discussion. So just to start with number one, the symptoms of failure and the recent history. Just to remind you that we transformed this industry quite radically after 1986. Before 1986, we had an essential service provided collectively. Since 1986, it's treated as a commodity like all other commodities, supplied largely by corporate enterprise. Before 1986, we priced electricity as cheaply as possible to households. That was the central policy goal with electricity, was the well-being of the population at large. Since 1986, we're pricing to recover the full costs of marginal generators and the monopoly price for network operators with a fat profit margin. And so that shift from a non-market to a market focus is really important in understanding how the pricing has changed. Before 1986, the electricity system was run by civil engineers with a commitment to optimal planning outcomes. And since 1986, it's run by corporate managers and financial engineers who are maximising profit and shareholder value. Before 1986, we had an integrated monopoly, but it had non-profit objectives. And since 1986, we've got multiple players in a very complicated institutional landscape, which was set up as a sort of a dream of creating a sort of simulacrum of a competitive model, a competitive market, but in a situation where a lot of the preconditions for that weren't present. And so there's a huge amount of financial, social, institutional engineering and architectural work went into building the market that we currently have. It's not something that emerged naturally. It emerged from an intensive series of discussions. The big promise back then was that corporatizing, reorganizing, and privatizing would give consumers gains. And the idea was that commercial management would raise efficiency and cut costs. The idea was that competition, or correctly done regulation, would force efficiency and productivity gains through to prices. And the proposition was that consumers therefore would get better service and lower prices, and profits could rise to share, so that the gains from more productive use of resources would be shared out. Now, look at those. That was a big promise. Back in the day, I looked at these promises and I was skeptical, but I thought, well, I'll be very interested to see how they go. And so we now know how it all turned out. First off, look at prices. And these are the prices for the three categories of consumers: industrial, commercial, and residential. What you can see there is that from a situation where residential consumers were paying, not a wee bit above industrials, quite well below commercials, we've seen a situation where residential prices have simply raced away between 1990 and 2014. There's this enormous escalation of the real price of electricity paid by households. At the same time, commercial prices have actually dropped, and industrial prices, until relatively recently, stayed pretty steady. So if you look at those curves, the first thing that you see about the way the residential price went, it rocketed up under the first 2 decades of corporatization and privatization. And then it hit the limitation of the residential demand curve. In first year economics, we explain that there is a profit maximizing price for a monopolist, beyond which, if they keep pushing the price up, they just collapse demand and don't get revenue. So about 2014, the electricity cartel hit the limits of what the residential market could take in terms of price gouging. And from there on out, you can actually see there's a downturn. People just started turning off the heaters, living with cold and misery, sometimes getting disconnected, buying more energy efficient appliances. All sorts of things happened that produced consumer resistance to further price rises. Given that, and given the drive to maximize shareholder value and profits, the industry had to look elsewhere for raising more revenue. And you can see that after 2018, the pressure came on industrial prices. And so this has become acute in the last 2 or 3 years as major industries have been closing down in the face of a sharp increase in the price of power. And even commercial prices have recently turned up. So you see here an industry which is pushing very hard against the limits of what the market will bear. Remember that the big promise was that we would get productivity and that would bring the prices down. But if you look at the productivity statistics, it's completely the opposite story. This is multi-factor productivity. That is the amount of output that you get from a combination of putting labour and capital into producing the product. The line with the little squares on it is how the New Zealand economy as a whole has performed since 1978. And you can see it's not brilliant, especially more recently. This economy's productivity performance is one of our real issues. But if you look at the electricity, gas, waste and water, and this is dominated by electricity, what you see is that this started, if you look at where reform starts, it was on a rapidly increasing productivity track until 86. There's a little sugar hit after that, as the industry had a big shakeout, mostly of labour. And then 1996, the wholesale market is established and the modern architecture of electricity production comes into being. And since then, you can see it's a non-stop slide right through to the present day. So in 2024, which is the latest year for which I've got the numbers, we're way below even the pre-reform level of productivity for the industry. Now, what does that say? I mean, if you take a look at when the changes took place, this is the average percentage change in productivity from 1978 to 2019. I'm sorry, I haven't got the last 5 years into this slide at this point. And you can see that before we started the reforms, the left-hand panel of that diagram, electricity, gas, water and waste services were highly productive and increasing their productivity way ahead of the economy as a whole. During corporatisation and part privatisation through the 90s, you can see that growth and productivity fell away relative to the economy as a whole. And since the Bradford reforms were bedded in, look across to the right, the red bar, which is electricity, gas, water and waste services, it's all downhill. While the rest of the economy certainly slowed, but at least the rest of the economy did increase its productivity. So the bottom line is that the sector's been loaded up with labour and capital that are doing unproductive stuff. Pursuit of profit, complicated games pretending to be competitive, financial engineering, high-paid jobs and sales and marketing and financial management. The bottom line as I see it is the corporatisation and privatisation, far from delivering the productivity gains and therefore lower prices that were promised, given us a gigantic exercise in rent-seeking waste. And the reason is, I think, that the reformers either didn't understand the economics of electricity in New Zealand or they didn't care. They were applying one-size-fits-all solutions that were imported from overseas, where the economics are different, and were dominated by neoliberal ideas. And what happened when we deregulated was we opened the door for looting and rent-seeking rather than for a competitive drive to high efficiency. It's just a case of ideology overwhelming common sense. And so a lot of what I'm going to say from here on out is what I think of as common sense. Okay, so we've got an uncompetitive oligopoly in charge of our most strategic sector. Productivity's down. Gross profits are up enormously. The construction of renewables has been slowed down. The new entrants are being blocked by anti-competitive practices. They're quite legal, those practices, by the way. The prices have doubled in real terms for residential consumers, and they're heading on up now. The commercial users' prices may be down, but they've recently turned up. Countervailing power is what really matters in uncompetitive markets, and that's why you see Tiwai Point occupying such a strategic role in relation to the system. And so the strategic goals of the industry as it currently stands are hostile to equitable climate change policy, and they're going to block progress unless we can break the power of the cartel. And that's not a small matter, I'm afraid. Now, if we just take a look at where the electricity comes from, this is the net generation mix from 1974 to 2025. The green line shows you what the renewables share was. And you can see that in 2024, the last year I've got numbers for, it was the same as 50 years ago, around about 90%. In the middle, there's the era when Huntly and New Plymouth and gas combined cycle and so on came into the mix. So we had an increasing amount of fossil fuels, and so it dropped. But it's pulled back again in the last couple of decades. The black line is total generation. And what you see there is that since about the turn of the century, that's flat. we've stopped growing our generation volumes. Basically since reform, these companies have been sitting on a pretty stable supply. And here are the components of it. Down the bottom, the dominant piece of the puzzle is hydro development, which we pretty well built by 1990. There's not much has happened there since. There's geothermal, which is indeed going well, has been growing fast. There's wind, and along with biomass, and solar, which is the yellow. Wind has been growing, solar is lagging. And then there's this black chunk on the margin, which is our coal, gas, and oil. Basically, that's now coal and gas, parked at the margin of supply. And the dry years are the big issue. If you look at the hydro over that period, you can see it's up and down and up and down. There's wet years and dry years. It ranges between about 20,000 and 28,000 gigawatt hours, depending on how the weather's turned out each year. And that's quite a high level of intermittency in a key renewable. And I'll come back to this question of hydro being an intermittent supply. The fossil fuels are sitting on the margin of supply, and that's the backstop for hydro over dry years, dry seasons. If we go to 100% renewables, we have to push that chunk of fossil fuels off the margin of supply, or we've got to get Huntley running on something that's renewable fuel, like wood chips perhaps. The electricity industry's central strategic goal is to maximize the demand for electricity while blocking the way to 100% renewables, because so long as fossil fuels stay in the mix, they're at the margin of the market. They set the spot price way up above the supply cost for hydro and geothermal and wind. And then in addition to that, with fossil fuels on the margin of the market, every increase in the carbon price through the emissions trading scheme or any other scheme we might bring in pushes up the price of all electricity. I'll show you that in a minute, including renewables, which means there are wealth transfers to the gentailers, even as other policy measures are trying to drive electrification in the economy. So the commercial viability of small-scale distributed renewable is quite sensitive to the price structure that households face. If you've considered putting solar on your roof, you'll be aware that the quotes you can get, they've got reasonable paybacks, 5 or 8 years or something, but it's not a slam dunk, especially when you've got upfront costs of installing the things. So the price that faces distributed generators will matter quite a lot, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The biggest threat to the profits of the gentailers is the huge wind resource. There's also a huge solar resource, but wind, I think, is the real potential threat. And what the gentailers have done is to lock up and bank all the onshore sites so that independents have great difficulty finding anywhere to build a big wind farm onshore. But offshore is still wide open, and that's a huge area for potential new development. But without institutional change, the government is simply captive to the stranglehold of the cartel. And here's the cartel banking their profits. This is the asset values of the four big gentailers, and you can see that the historic cost of their assets, that's what they've actually spent to develop things, is the grey line at the bottom of that chart, and all the coloured lines are the revaluations of assets that they've booked to reflect their profitability. And that's nearly $20 billion of wealth transfer from consumers just locked into their book values, which they will now defend like crazy because a drop in price will actually threaten those asset values. Here's the distribution companies. They've banked about $8 billion of revaluation gains over the period. And that again is a wealth transfer from consumers. Now, if we look at the structure of demand, the green one at the bottom is residential, the grey one is industry, the top one is commercial. And you can see that residential at the bottom used to be 46% of total consumption. It's now down to 35%. The share of the total has dropped. If you look at where the revenue comes from, the residential at the bottom used to be 39% of total revenue, and it's now 48% of total revenue. What's happened is that as the share of residential consumption has dropped, its share of the revenue has been driven up. And the reason for that is simply that you've got captive consumers who can't escape very readily. The Crown, of course, is a key recipient of the cash benefit of all this, and these are the revenues from dividends to the Crown, the light blue, the taxes on the companies, the Crown, we've got the Crown's involved in green, the taxes from other big generators, Contact and Trustpower, now Manawa Energy in the purple, and the selling off the family silver gains, the red, from corporatisation and privatisation. So the Crown is very much dependent on a continuing flow of big profits out of this industry, which is why, for example, I think Labor in its energy policy recently announced was basically just going to grab the profits and spend them on doctors rather than focus on bringing prices down. Basic theory, how to read demand and supply curves. Now, this is just what first-year economists do. There's a supply curve and a demand curve. The supply curve slopes up, and you think of that, there's a whole set of producers, and you arrange them in order from the shortest ones at the left, who are the low-cost producers, up to the tall ones on the right, the high-cost producers. And the demand curve just shows you basically if you drive the price up, you do reduce the quantity demanded, but that's quite steep. And for short-run thinking, you can almost treat that as vertical in New Zealand. The price of the market is the PE there. It's the point where supply and demand are in balance. And that means that the price is set by the most expensive supply that is actually needed to meet demand. And everybody who's producing inside that quantity all get the same price, PE. That's how the market works. The single price is paid to all recipients. So here's the total revenue, the price times the quantity. And that breaks down between two components. There's the costs of all the suppliers. And remember, we've put them in order of ascending costs. So you just add up the cost of the first one, the cost of the second one, and so on, and you get that yellow area, which is their cost of supplying. And the pink is what they pick up over and above that, just because they're getting the price that's set out there at the margin of the market. Now, that producer surplus has been the focus of a lot of my work, because that is where the very high profitability of the gentailers comes from. Out here on the margin of the market, who is the high-cost supplier that's setting the price? It's basically Huntly. And so long as Huntly is out there, the price is held up. Inside the market, there is a lot of sharing around of this producer surplus, because big industry with lots of muscle can actually come in and get special deals from the gentailers for low price electricity, which effectively means they share some of the rent from the low cost hydro, and take some of the supply, and in the process they keep demand up. So TY Point is that little chunk that goes out of the producer surplus into the hands of Rio Tinto. Now, if you look at that, the immediate question you should ask yourself is, well, hang on, why aren't residential consumers under the same deal? In other words, why does TY Point get a deal that residentials don't get? And residentials are charged that full marginal price plus all the add-ons. If you go back, we've always known about this. In 1988, I drew this diagram for the Royal Commission on Social Policy. Here's TY Point over there at the left. There's precisely the diagram I just showed you, with all the rent coming into the electricity division of NZED. In 1992, I co-authored a study that recommended that we should put in place a two-part progressive tariff with a contract that would supply residential consumers with 20,000 gigawatt hours at a wholesale price of 2 cents. You won't be surprised that option was rejected out of hand by the designers of the market, because this was not at all what they had in mind. But we've been here for a long time, that the possibility that long-run contracts could be struck with the industry to get low-priced electricity through to households. And the 2013 proposal for a single buyer that Labor and the Greens tried on, but it didn't succeed at the election, but it was a proposition more or less along these lines. Okay, now let's come to the working of the market. Imagine the market like this. Here's the supply curve, the red line. It's got a whole lot of low-cost hydro and geothermal suppliers here, and it's got the high-cost coal and gas stations out there on the margin of the market. TY Point is sitting in there sucking up a large chunk of cheap electricity, and the rest of us are out there at the margin paying that marginal price. Now look at the how that all breaks down. Here's the cost of the low-cost producers, that's area A. The high-cost producers have area B. The rent going to the low-cost producers, that's their profit over and above their costs, is area C. And you just ask yourself, what's the cost of supplying the quantity? Is it A plus B, or is it A plus B plus C? And in terms of the discussions that we had at the beginning of the electricity reforms, the model that we brought into place, marginal cost pricing, essentially said A plus B plus C is the true cost of electricity. And the old model, which was focused on consumer welfare, said, oh, we'll take the average, which just take A plus B and charge it on through as a bulk supply tariff. And one of those gives you happy consumers and one of them gives you unhappy consumers, and you can see which is which. Now, the big profits rely on keeping that margin up there and high. So take a look at two things that can happen. First off, suppose TY point closes. Then the demand goes left. There's less demand for electricity. Lo and behold, the market price comes right down to PL. So if you just look at closed TY point, bang, you can see why the gentailers have fought so hard to keep TY point open, because it keeps their market, tight. Yep, open TY point, you've got the demand is like that. Close it, it goes to there, and the price shifts radically. Suppose then that you build a whole lot more low-cost renewable supply. Suppose the gentailers had really piled in and built lots of wind and solar in the last decade. They would have pushed the supply curve out, and that would have brought the price down as well. And again, that goes down to their profits and their shareholder value. So the core strategy for the gentailers is to keep demand up as high as possible, get as many big contract buyers as they can find, and keep supply constrained by blocking the appearance of too many wind farms and too much solar. Here's another wrinkle. Here's the market, and here's the effect of Huntly paying carbon charges through the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme. That pushes up the price of power from Huntly. That pushes up the price of power for everybody. That means that there's a great chunk of extra profit goes through to the gentailers. And when Frontier did their report last year, they said there's $1.5 billion that consumers are paying just because of the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme. 223 million is actual charged on the emissions from Huntly, and 1.2 billion was just a pure windfall gain to the hydro operator and geothermal operators. They just banked that as unearned profit out of nowhere. So what does that imply? It says there's $1 billion, about 10% of what consumers are paying for electricity, that you can just knock off the total by taking Huntly out of the market, or exempting electricity from the emissions trading scheme like agriculture, or pushing Huntly off the margin by installing lots of renewables, or lots of other possibilities. Then there's the question of market manipulation. Wallach and Paletti have written on this. When things are scarce, the marginal suppliers bid high above their actual marginal cost. So the marginals bid way up high when we've got a dry year on something. And that gives you manipulation rents from basically bid into the market at very high prices. And again, you just add that to the bottom line for the gentailers. And so here's the total picture as I draw it for the market. There's a great chunk of what we call Ricardian rent. That's just the profits that Contact and Mercury and Meridian get from just owning very low cost hydro and geothermal supply. There's the carbon rent, which is them freeloading on the emissions trading scheme. And there's the manipulation rent, which is their ability to mess around with the wholesale market price at times of scarcity. So there is a huge chunk there of profit, which is why prices are so high. But it is entirely consistent with the design of the market as it currently stands. And I think this is the intentional outcome of that market design. So when we think about competition for the market versus the cartel, let's look at where distributed renewables and batteries fit in. And I'm conscious I'm short of time, so I'll do this quickly and push on to talk about what this all means. This is another first-year diagram for economists. Again, on the left-hand side is the cost of electricity from the existing industry up that left-hand axis. Along the horizontal, we have the the gigawatt hours of electricity, and the supply curve that I drew before is that red line running up there. And the vertical line at the right-hand side is the demand, the amount of demand for electricity. So the diagram has total demand as its width, and all the market here is controlled by the incumbent cartel. And if you think about a new industry coming in to compete for the market, and here we think about rooftop solar, independent offshore wind farms, farmers with solar arrays in their paddocks, industry in Auckland putting solar arrays all over the roofs of their factories and warehouses, that sort of thing. Think of that as coming into the market out from outside the existing industry. Now, so long as it's not competitive with the marginal supply in the existing market, it doesn't get much market share. But if it becomes competitive, if the cost of new renewables and batteries and so on begins to come down, this is what happens. If the market doesn't grow, the new supplier just simply undercuts the existing supplier. So it has a market share that grows and grows and grows, and the incumbent's assets become stranded. That is, they have to write their value off because they're simply pushed out of the market by the arrival of the new supplier. Now, the crucial point here is that the suppliers, the driver in this change in market share is that the new supplier comes from outside the cartel. It's an independent source of supply that's not controlled from the centre. And so it can capture market share and it can drive price down. Now, you have to think about now the consequences if demand increases. And here's where the strategic play comes in. So here's the same diagram as before, except that I've moved the demand, I've got the demand curve a bit further to the left. Here's the existing market with the existing supply curve and the existing price. Now imagine that we bring in the new independent supply of distributed renewables, but at the same time the demand for electricity goes up. So simultaneously we're electrifying the economy and supplying it from distributed generation, but we've left the existing cartel with its existing market and potentially its existing price. And so there are two ways this could play out. One is this segmented market model that I've got here. In that case, the existing market continues to trade at PL, or P, looks like PI on the left. That is the price set by Huntley. Outside that market, a whole lot of prosumers are getting their electricity at the lower price PX, which is the cost of supplying your own off the roof, effectively, with some intelligent add-ons. And so that segmented market is a potential outcome from the arrival of the new technologies. Now, the new technologies are arriving, and here's two bits of evidence. First one, this is from Concept Consulting, which is the industry's key consulting group. And you can see that the blue line is what the gentailers have been charging in contract prices for their electricity, and the orange bars are the actual long-run marginal cost. That is the cost of producing electricity from new construction in renewables. And you can see that for the last 7 or 8 years, the contract price is way, way above what the actual cost of new supply is. This is another diagram from Mike Casey, who I think you're going to be talking to at some stage. The downward sloping lines is the cost of solar and battery with or without connection to the grid. And the upward sloping line is the cost of grid electricity. And you can see that the crossover point where the new solar battery combinations simply become cheaper than the existing grid electricity is around about the early 2020s. And we're now beyond that crossover point, and we're in a situation where the new technologies actually can undercut the grid supply. And so the technological frontier is closing in. The cost of solar panels and batteries has crashed far enough to make it cheaper to go off-grid than to pay the prices being charged for the grid power, if you have the financial ability to finance it. And that's what we call competition for the market, as distinct from competition within the market. We haven't had competition within the market, but this is real competition that's arriving. And the big threat is not from competition among the gentailers, but the new sources of supply, distributed, decentralized panels and wind turbines and batteries. And this is actually quite like the threat that cell phones producers had for landlines 2 decades ago, moving from a totally centrally monopolistically supplied supply of the service to totally decentralized, where everybody has their own cell phones and has a great deal of freedom about what they're connected to and what they take over them. So this new technology is going to be very similarly disruptive to the mobile phone technology of the 1990s and 2000s. This opens up a wide range of options for consumers, and so we come to market design. I'll try and do I've run out of time, I'm sorry. I'll try to do this as quick as I can. There's a wide range of new options now for consumers. In the long run, each consumer can actually choose between living off-grid with solar batteries and so on, or with connection to the grid. And so to keep the grid connection to the grid the preferred choice for consumers, either grid electricity has to be competitively priced and offer value added compared to standalone prosumers, that's consumers who produce their own, or there's got to be some regulatory constraint that prevents you going off grid. We can't achieve this with the present asset valuations of the gentailers and Transpower. There's going to have to be write-downs to reflect the fact that electricity is getting cheaper and cheaper to produce, and the incumbent producers have built their market models on high prices and therefore high asset values. The market eventually will do that just by stranding unutilized assets, but that's very disruptive, obviously. And the grid is a treasure. It's something that New Zealand built up collectively over a decade, over a century, and it's not something we would readily want to throw away. But the incumbent industry players will want taxpayers to pick up all the costs of adjusting the situation, socialising the losses. So the politics are going to be tough. Let's suppose that the distributed renewables come in within the existing market model. Okay, so there we put all the new renewables in, but we keep the existing market model exactly as it is. That is, we force them all to trade through the wholesale market. Then we've got this problem that we'll have excess supply inevitably because wind and solar are intermittent, and wind, solar, batteries, and hydro. We're balancing intermittency across various different sorts of intermittent supply. We're going to have to build excess supply, and that will have to be curtailed to balance the market. Some wind, some solar, some hydro at various times has to sit idle rather than selling its output. The question is, who gets curtailed? And that depends on the market structure after we've brought the distributed renewables into it. So Transpower and the gentailers are assuming, and if you look at their planning documents, this is the way they think, that they will get scheduled as usual and the distributed solar and wind will get curtailed under the heading of demand management, which is directed from the centre. But the heritage hydro is actually the prime potential source of battery firming for the distributed renewables. That is, we should be running our hydro system as the backstop for the distributed solar and wind. When there's lots of solar and wind, hydro should be cutting back and saving water, and vice versa. And I've got a whole set of slides saying Steve Paletti and I have done a whole pile of modelling about this. I'm not going to do it for you now. I'm just going to flick through to show you that there is a lot of heavyweight computer stuff has been going on, and I'm going to come out the other end of that and talk about market design. The first thing we've got to do is to have an arena for genuine competition at the local level, that is downstream of the grid. And for a small country, the option of decentralising the renewables with small and medium operators taking responsibility for their own resource mobilisation is the logical starting point, unless you're committed to the privileged position of the vested interests. Now, I'm not, so I'm going to talk much more radically than they do. Here's how MB, for example, sees the industry, a total top-down thing with supply happening all at the left-hand side with the big generators and coming down through transmission and then through the distribution, and domestic users and businesses are just sitting out there as passive absorbers of what's decided at the centre. And the planning on that basis really removes the agency and autonomy from domestic users and businesses. System operators way up there. But here's the alternative vision. Suppose we keep the existing grid system like that as an asset, but over here we have distributed generation with homes and farms and businesses with their solar panels and their batteries and their little wind farms and all of that generating electricity as well. Then you've got two competing sources of supply into the local market, where I'm suggesting we need a local aggregator to actually run the local market on the basis that there are two competing sources of supply off the grid on the one, from the grid on the left-hand side, and from the distributed on the right-hand side. There'll be wholesale traders who will compete to market the grid's electricity. There will be independent retailers competing to buy up and market the distributed stuff. And in the middle of the market, there will be some sort of aggregator where local prices are set. The technology implies that we need institutions that are fit for competition for the market, from this sort of market, which is what we've got, with big central generation and little distributed, to a market where we've got big distributed coming in to balance against remote generation. And so the action here has to shift from the point at which the power goes into the grid to the point where it comes off the grid, with the distribution lines as an open access platform and distributed generation competing head-to-head with the remote generation coming off the grid. Two changes that you've got to make then. The first thing is breaking the vertical integration of generation and retail so that you can get independent retailers free to operate on the local networks, not necessarily buying from the remote gentailer source of supply, just buying from the lowest cost source. The second thing that has to happen is that the transmission charges, which currently are passed through to everybody and therefore are a great disincentive for rooftop solar, are going to have to be bundled with the spot market wholesale price of the gentailers, so that the transmission and the generation costs of the grid system are all priced in a bundle at the grid exit point, right? And I'll come back to that in just a second. And I think that you almost certainly have to stop the lines energy split that we put in with the Bradford reforms at the local level, so that we can effectively go back to something like the old electric power boards, who can manage the local market with the local network as the arena for competition. But they will probably have to have ability to handle energy as well as lines, that is to say, to be the coordinating operator within the local market. The wrinkles are, first off, this is decentralizing quite radically, because what we want is that the sources of supply into every local network are in a merit order of what's the lowest cost, most reliable supply. That'll differ from place to place. It won't be the same solution in every locality. And the call on grid supply is then going to be a residual demand after the cost competitive distributed supply has been utilized, which is a complete change from the present system where the grid dominates. In this case, the grid simply takes what the residual demand is after the distributed generation is operated up to the constraints of the local networks. Now, assuming that the competing independent retailers are taking distributed supply through prosumer meters and drawing on wholesale grid supply to make up total volumes, somebody's got to be active downstream of the grid exit point to coordinate all this. And we've got nothing of that in the current architecture. So there's quite a big job to be done rethinking how local electricity markets are going to be structured. And up at the top, the system operator and Transpower's got a very complicated coordination problem, because they've got the heritage hydro assets, which effectively I think should be managed as the backstop to the intermittency of wind and solar supply in the distributed system, which is quite different from what they're currently doing with the gentailer assets. And handling this through the current market mechanism means you've got to find some way of persuading the hydro assets to act in a socially responsible way as a backstop for distributed supply, rather than acting as a dominant monopolist, simply grabbing the maximum profit from manipulating the water. So that's politically really, really tough. And we can discuss that in a minute. When you look at price, I'm arguing that we have to take the generation, transmission and coordination supply and bundle it. And that's what we used to do under the old NZED. We had generation, which is an increasing cost activity. As you increase volume, the cost goes up. and transmission, which was a decreasing cost activity. As you increase the volume, the costs come down because it's mostly fixed costs. You put them together and average them, and you get the old bulk supply tariff, which is how we used to charge our wholesale electricity. I think competition for the market from distributed supply almost inevitably forces us back to something like this, where Transpower and the gentailers pull their costs and prices and and offer a price for wholesale supply at the grid exit points. There's a whole pile of detail in that, and we can come back to it if you like. So that means the current pass-through of Transpower charges has to stop. At present, the Commerce Commission just approves total revenue. Transpower passes it up by grid exit point and charges it to distributors. They pass it straight through to the retailer, and they pass it through to the customers. And that penalises distributed supply by forcing the owners of rooftop solar to pay a cross subsidy to the grid, even if they're not needing the grid. And that is a strong incentive, by the way, for them to go off grid, which is something that I think we want to try to discourage if we can. Without the ability as the dominant monopolist to force recovery of its total revenue, Transpower's asset valuation would face a write-down. And that, again, is a problem with the state-owned enterprise with a profit mandate. Other elements of pricing, we could price network servicing for cost recovery. Retail services would be competitive. Distributed supply, we almost certainly need an administered price. Come back to that in a second. How the feed-in tariff rate gets set is therefore really, really important. When you have solar on your roof and you supply into the network, what do you get paid for that? Do you have individual retailers bidding for your supply to get a competitive price? Do we have a regulator that sets the price at which all the retailers purchase from households and distributed producers? Do we develop on from the status quo where we set the grid supply price and then price the household price to parity with that, with some discounts and top-ups? This is the sort of stuff that we need to be thinking about. Now, at retail level, I think that does mean regulation is needed. You'll need pricing boundaries to get the best outcome in terms of affordability and reliability of supply. The market mechanism probably won't do the trick. The reservation price at which it's optimal for people with rooftop solar to take advantage of being connected to the grid is the alternative of becoming islands. And the market won't immediately tell you where the valuable islands lie, that is off-grid communities supplying themselves without using anything off the grid. That's a really difficult planning problem. But it is the threat. I mean, the threat of the whole country basically going back to local supply and stranding the grid and the gentailers, is the sort of reductio ad absurdum at the end of the tunnel of competition for the market. Now, if you look around, the Haast system down in the South Island is an energy island. It has the Fraser River hydro scheme and backs up with diesel generators. It's off-grid. There's no grid connection. And so the cost of power there hasn't gone high enough to justify the effort of getting connected to the grid. Chatham Islands, of course, is forced to be in the same position. In the immediate future, you look at top energy up in the far north where the Ngāwhā geothermal and the solar arrays that are coming in. I mean, the area is exporting electricity to the grid. It's not absorbing electricity, it's selling it. And so an island is actually quite possible. Transpower has decommissioned the grid north of Kaikoura because the grid performs no function up there. The local supply simply dominates it. But for most local networks, I'm arguing it must be optimal to keep connection to the grid alongside distributed supply. But the capacity to survive off-grid if the central supply fails is a really important option to have. If you remember, Transpower knocked over a pylon up north, and the whole of Northland went out, whereas if they'd had islanded capacity, they could have kept going. Remember, Hurricane Gabriel knocked out the Redcliffe substation up in Napier, and all of Hawke's Bay was knocked off the grid. If they'd had islanded ability to supply themselves, they wouldn't have gone down. Resilience and reliability actually are now tied to decentralization, not centralization. So we need to change the focus of regulation from protecting asset values to redirecting the way we use the heritage hydro and set the order of priority for scheduling. So the ownership of the heritage hydro assets matters a lot. It'd be great if we had them back in public ownership and we could just put them into social use, but the mixed ownership model gives us much less room to move. And the system operator is going to have to shift from just dispatching a merit order generation fleet to actually managing the heritage hydro as a backstop for the rest of the system. So prices got to come down significantly, but the government's got to break monopoly power, resurrect local electricity supply authorities to operate communities downstream of the grid, tender procurement contracts for offshore wind large scale, keeping it out of the gentailers' hands, because if the gentailers get their hands on offshore wind, they'll just build it into their existing market model and have no effect on price. And we've got to get the true economics of renewable energy into the market by forcing the established vested interests to compete in the face of the new technology. And I've got a list of things that are involved here. Now, I've run out of time, and I'm sorry I went 10 minutes over where I'd hoped to be, but hopefully there's space there for some questions. Over to you, back to you.
Thank you, Geoff, and thank you very much. I mean, it's such an incredibly comprehensive presentation, and I'll just ask Amy, has there been any questions or comments as we've gone along?
No, we don't have any questions as yet.
Okay.
Oh,
No problem. There you go. You must have answered all the questions already, Geoff. Just in the limited time we have left, and I don't want to hold people up too long. There's a couple of thoughts that I had, and I mean, your summary slide, I think, sort of probably answered that. I was wondering, as we went along, there's a lot of very important detail there. If let's just imagine a situation where Simeon Brown was on the call and he said, Geoff, just give me 3 things. And let's imagine for a second that he was open to the idea of not carrying on with some of those monopolistic barriers that you talked about at the beginning. If he said, Geoff, just give me 3 things that will actually set things off here and make them brief things that I can remember, what would you say are those 3 things?
well, number one, there's a suggestion from Frontier Economics last year that the government rejected for obvious reasons. Get Huntly out of the market, and you can do that immediately by the mechanism that Frontier suggested. That is, you simply put Huntly into a separate, either a separate company or ring fence Huntly and have it contracted to provide backstop firming for the electricity system, but you don't let Huntly go bidding into the wholesale market and driving the spot price. In other words, you can institutionally force fossil fuel out of the market by ring fencing it and pricing it separately from the rest. This is a segmented market model, if you like, and that would leave the existing hydro and geothermal assets alongside the new distributed wind and solar and batteries, all competing on a relatively level playing field where the price of renewables would be what sets the price of electricity. That on its own ought to bring prices down pretty radically. Firstly, because it takes Huntly's high costs out of the electricity price bid, and secondly, because it removes the emissions trading scheme carbon levy, because taking Huntly away means Huntly pays its emissions trading scheme costs on its own, but it doesn't pass the benefit of the higher price through to all the hydro and geothermal. So that's number one, just a surgical removal of Huntly out of the market. Bang. It's quite an exciting proposition, in fact. But I can't imagine Simeon Brown doing it because, of course, Nicola Willis then loses $1 billion of revenue just like that, and she won't be pleased. Well, it won't be $1 billion; it will be a few hundred million. So that's number one. Number two, I think you've got to look where Australia's gone. The government has a leadership role and a subsidy role in really getting rooftop solar and distributed wind and solar rolling out fast, and that requires that you give certainty to the people who are thinking of building those things, and you give as much upfront financial support as you possibly can. And there's a whole lot of ways of doing that. One of them is to just guarantee a feed-in tariff. You say to households, here's what you will be guaranteed to get when you sell into the system, and that just transforms the economics of putting solar panels on your roof and for farmers putting solar in the fields and so on. The other thing is that the upfront cost of panels and batteries is the real killer. at the moment for the rollout. And what Australia has done over the last 2 decades is just, subsidise those things. You can either subsidise directly, or you can do it indirectly by things like shared equity schemes, where a government agency goes and installs the solar panels and the batteries and so on, and has full ownership of them at the beginning, but has a leasing agreement whereby the ownership transfers to the property owner over a period of time. And in the interim, there's a sharing of the benefits from the current arrival of that extra electricity. Now, we had a model that was doing something like that in Solar Zero, which of course BlackRock had underwritten, and BlackRock pulled out, and the whole thing fell apart. And that model of somebody undertaking the upfront cost of the capital installation and then sharing the downstream benefits with the property owner on whose roof the panels have gone, or the renter onto whose balcony the panels have been installed. There's all sorts of models here, but there's all sorts of ways of sharing the benefits that overcome the well-known barriers of, first, the upfront cost of the things, and secondly, the landlord-tenant problem, where tenants don't have an incentive to improve the property. There's also quite a lot to be gained from looking seriously at that was number two. Do something about accelerating the rollout of these technologies. Don't just wait for the market to do it. The market will do it, but it will be disruptive, and the poor will suffer while the rich benefit. Simply because the rich can afford to do it and the poor can't. What we want is a model that really gets this stuff rolled out and the benefits rolled out to low-income communities. That almost certainly means that this is the third part of the story. I reckon we've got to revive the old electric power boards. We need a local authority with the agency and the power to do stuff, so that communities can collectively start solving this problem for themselves, not just waiting for central government and the gentailers and Transpower to solve it for them, but actually be part of the action, and collectively solving the problems of coordinating local supply into the local network, managing demand effectively, ensuring that the benefits are distributed right, providing support schemes for the low-income parts of the community who basically can't do stuff on their own, but really deserve to get the benefits from the new technology. So those have been my three for Simeon. I can't imagine he'd be delighted, because along the way I'm busting Transpower's pricing model. And driving a truck through what the Electricity Authority is currently designing as its distribution pricing policies. These are big disruptive changes, and I think the moment has come to be bold and radical, and I'm afraid not friendly to the gentailers and Transpower. I think it will take a lot of pressure to break that cartel and bring it down to pricing at a level that is consistent with the new technology on the margin of the market. But long-run marginal cost must speak to electricity prices.
No, that's great. Thank you. And look, just one last little quick question following up from that for me. So in your view, I mean, electricity has sort of become the topic at the moment. It's on the news every morning. Given the model that you've just set out, the impression that I get is sort of the debate about LNG versus diesel versus big, battery projects in the middle of Central Otago sound like kind of sideshows compared to what you're talking about. Is that a fair thing to say, that we're kind of being asked to look in the wrong direction?
Yeah, sideshows is a very polite description. I mean, these are gigantic white elephants that are being brought in to dominate the debates in the interests of but basically people who are not ordinary residential consumers. If somebody wants to go and lose their shirt building Lake Onslow, that's fine. But if they want to spend $16 billion and then expect to be able to price the result through by levying all the consumers for the privilege of having Lake Onslow in existence, I think that's a non-starter. But I'm perfectly happy for somebody to take a huge loss on Lake Onslow for my benefit. But I'm not happy to be told that it's my job to support Lake Onslow for the community's benefit. Ditto the LNG terminal. The future lies with the new renewable supply technologies. We have a lot of sunshine. We've got a lot of wind, and batteries are becoming more and more affordable. The idea that we stick with these gigantic central monopoly-dominated ways of solving the problem rather than getting on with making the economy as a whole sing, I think is nuts. This is where Think Big came from. Muldoon had exactly the same frame of mind. Let's have big projects that solve the problem, and I will dictate what they are going to be, and then everybody else will carry the costs. And we're doing it again. St. John's is just Muldoon with a different label on, with the same driver and Simeon, I suspect. And we really have to get them out of that mindset and back to actually thinking about ordinary New Zealanders being reasonably smart, reasonably intelligent, able to manage stuff, and able to take a lot of their future into their own hands for their own benefit. We've just got to empower them and take away the barriers, both the regulatory barriers and, most importantly, the monopolistic anti-competitive barriers that have stalled this thing in New Zealand, while the rest of the world, well, not the rest of the world, not everybody's moving on. Australia's moving very fast. The United States is going backwards. China's pushing ahead. But you see, the Chinese at the moment have precisely the curtailment problem right up front. They've got massive excess capacity now in solar and wind, which is great. But they've also got all these coal plants running inflexibly on base load, and the coal plants just refuse to shut down when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, so they have to turn the wind and the sun off and keep running the coal as a condition of maintaining reliable supply, because they do rely on having the coal base load there. So the Chinese are right up against this problem, but it's got a different shape in China. It'll have different solutions. New Zealand, we've got lots of room here for a flexible, quite creative way of solving this problem. But we do have to work out who is going to just stand and wait when there's excess supply from the intermittents. And I'm saying first call is the distributed wind and solar into the market. That gives you a residual demand, and the third player off the rank is hydro, because hydro has a different pattern of intermittency from wind and solar, and the three of those naturally have a synergy, and we've got to try and grab the benefits of that synergy across the technologies. And that probably means we're going to have to do something about the ownership and control of the heritage hydro assets. I'd much rather they were in public ownership with a non-profit mandate, but between here and there is a very ugly political problem.
And I think for me, one of the most interesting things you said, that, for whatever reason, Muldoon and co built things like Clyde Dam. In our times, they actually built a battery. They just didn't call it that, but there it is. And if we thought about it that way, then we think completely different about that asset and how it can be used.
Yeah. Well, New Zealand as a whole funded the construction of all that hydro. You saw the diagram. We haven't built anything since 1990. It's all heritage stuff. And it's a hugely valuable resource. But to extract its real value, we've got to stop just putting it in the hands of people who run the hydro for maximum profit. And we've got to get it across onto the direction of people who will use that as our key backstop to intermittent wind and solar. And day to day, and in fact month to month, that's the real key to running the New Zealand system efficiently. Over dry years, the important thing for covering dry years is actually we're going to have to carry excess capacity of renewables. And if we're carrying excess capacity, somebody has got to have their capacity sitting idle some of the time. And there's lots of possible ways of arranging the pricing and the scheduling of those things. That's where the debate should be. I mean, we shouldn't be wasting our time talking about LNG and Onslow and all that stuff. We should be focusing on how on earth are we going to make this thing work efficiently with the best technology giving us the most reliable possible supply at the lowest possible price. That's what economics ought to be about. And so the debate's just been captured by the loudest voices, unfortunately.
Hey Geoff, I'm thank you so much. I'm mindful of time, and probably people want to catch a bit of lunch before their next meeting, can I just thank you very, very sincerely. I invited you to be our first speaker because I knew you would do exactly what you have done, which is really traverse everything. And you've laid out there, I think, a proposal in full implementation detail for others to look at and to respond to. So the straw man, it's better than a straw man, it's a steel man, is up there really for other speakers in our series, I think, to respond to and reflect on. If I can just
Sorry about the time.
that's quite all right. Thank you. I think it was worth it. Just before we go, just in terms of where to next for the webinar series, Amy, thumbs up, you can see the slide. Our next speaker will be 2 weeks today. It'll be Rachel Afiaki, who is the chair of the Well Energy Trust here on the Waikato. And so she'll be reflecting on those questions that we've put to all our speakers, 24th of June, 11 a.m. The invitation will be out for this in the next few days. And then just a little bit of a look at our upcoming speakers as well, which I hope you'll all join us for. People like Mike Casey from Rewired Aotearoa, Jonathan Kay from Waipa Networks, Manu Barrett from Solar Sense, Quile Wong from the Opportunity Party, Simon Bridges from the Auckland Chamber, Kelly Pike from Goika, who I know is on the call today, and Blair Dickey from the Waikato Regional Council, and there will be more as well. So hopefully you get that into your diary every second Wednesday from now until the 4th of November. Okay, so look, on behalf of Wellbeing Waikato, thank you all very, very much for joining us today, and thank you in particular, Geoff. If I had asked a consultant to do that, I would be facing a six-figure sum of a bill by now. I really, really appreciate what you've done. Really, well, thank you, and an impressive one at that. So thank you to you and to all our guests for joining us today. I am just going to close us with a karakia. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o te tātou iriki o ihu karaiti, me te araha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tangi taha, ki te wairua tapu ake ake, āmene. Thanks everybody, have a lovely day.